If there's one seeming law of politics, it's that every political alliance formed is always within a few years of falling apart due to differences of opinion. It seems as true for Cold War geopolitics as it is for modern Twitter. When we think of the Cold War's international relationships, we don't tend to think of capitalist countries as being a unified monolithic force, but the view from the West towards the so-called socialist bloc often presented socialism as a single unified force. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. Different countries in the socialist sphere had significant differences and disagreements with each other to the point of major diplomatic fractures, leading to significant weaknesses in the communist bloc. I'm your host David, and today we're going to look at some of the famous socialist breakups and what their different socialisms looked like. This is the Cold War. The first major split in the Soviet-dominated socialist alliance happened between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Often this is thought of as an ideological disagreement, but it had much more to do with the post-Second World War state of the Balkans. During the war, Stalin looked to spread Soviet influence to Europe, wanting as much physical distance between the USSR and his potential enemies. Yugoslavia was always a complicated part of this situation. The country came under Nazi occupation before Barbarossa and the end of the non-aggression pact between Berlin and Moscow. Later in the war, Josip Broz Tito planned to lead a Yugoslav communist rebellion against Nazi occupiers, but by then, Stalin was in an alliance with the capitalist powers, who happened to be harboring Yugoslavia's monarchist government in exile. A government that was already fighting a low-key guerrilla war to get Peter II back in control. Open support and the use of communist symbols might drive a wedge in a necessary relationship to fight back the Axis powers. Within a month of the start of Tito's campaign against the Nazis, the leader of the monarchist forces, Draza Mihailovich, who opposed the communist partisans so much he began collaborating with the Nazis to fight them instead, or as well. Even so, because of the alliance between Moscow and the Western Allies, the Soviets were printing pro-Mihailovich propaganda even while Tito and Mihailovich were fighting each other. Tito continued his campaign, and as his success grew, he began to set up his own independent government for Yugoslavia, which was both anti-fascist and anti-monarchy. Stalin had instructed Tito to not antagonize the monarchist government, and so this certainly helped make relations between Belgrade and Moscow, as my stepdaughter would say, icy. Tito's government eventually took over as they defeated their fascist occupiers. During this struggle, Tito had become a regional leader in communist forces opposing the Nazi occupation, with an especially close relationship with the Albanians. Meanwhile, Stalin, immediately following the Second World War, tried to solidify Soviet control over all of Eastern Europe. We've done several videos on this channel regarding this if you want more on how that process unfolded. Now, even with Tito and Stalin signing an immediate post-war treaty of friendship between Yugoslavia and the USSR, things were complicated. Tito wasn't the compliant puppet Stalin wanted him to be. He made map drawing after the war complex, making bold claims to territory, including at one point a decent chunk of Italy and Hungary. He also claimed regional influence over other Balkan nations. Tito then criticized Stalin publicly for not supporting those claims. Additionally, Tito's land claims regularly clashed with the West, especially in places like Trieste and Macedonia. So, because Tito was a communist, the West assumed he did all of this with Stalin's support. This came from a poor understanding in the West that communism wasn't a single unified ideology with one leader, but like any general movement, a factionalized and diverse group of movements with a multitude of self-interested actors. Tito was making an already tense situation worse. Furthermore, Tito's desire to become a regional power in the Balkans ran directly against Stalin's desire to bring all of Eastern Europe under his thumb. These conflicting goals led to escalating bad relations between the two men, which resulted in a series of angry letters between them, framed as policy disagreements, and then a total breakdown of relations between the two countries. Yugoslavia continued to resist Soviet influence, eventually establishing a unique socialist country navigating its way between the Cold War sides and helping to establish its own third side, the non-aligned movement. Yugoslavia also navigated its own form of market socialism. While the USSR managed a direct, centralized command economy, Yugoslavia had private companies. The economy was not centrally managed, with companies instead being overseen by workers' councils made up of employees. Managers were elected by the workers they'd be managing. All employees of a company then shared in the profits of that company. In the 1970s, these different companies began to federate into larger confederations, sometimes controlling entire industries. They traded with Western powers and even allowed foreign investment from the late 1960s. This mixed economy seemed to work to some extent. Still, Yugoslavia had much higher unemployment than the USSR, where it varied heavily from region to region. This employment sent many Yugoslavs abroad, a diaspora of Yugoslavs looking for work, with many ending up in West Germany. This labor flight was a significant problem for most of Yugoslavia's post-war years. Now, let's shift our attention to the East. The USSR's split with the People's Republic of China was a lot more rooted in actual ideological differences in implementing a Marxist-Leninist agenda. The disagreement was specifically between the PRC's leader, Mao Zedong, and the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Mao was a communist theoretician and sought to solve the problem of modernizing the PRC. The problem was how to apply a theory designed for urban, industrialized countries and still make it work for a vast, heavily agricultural country like China. What he developed was a system that would come to be called socialism with Chinese characteristics. It emphasized pragmatism as the priority in leading the rapid modernization of the Chinese economy, even if any actions taken to do so went against the norms of orthodox Marxism. After all, Marx had written his theories in the context of 19th century Europe and not with mid-20th century Asia in mind. The People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union signed a friendship treaty in 1950. Unlike the more puppet-like governments in East and Central Europe, the PRC was allowed control over its government with no interference from Moscow. However, the USSR was still the hegemon of the communist world, and the PRC leaned into the Soviet Union for advice and assistance. Stalin agreed to trade deals, industrialization projects, and sent thousands of technicians and political advisors to help out Mao and the Chinese communists. After Stalin's death, however, things began to sour between the two nations as Mao did not like or trust the man who eventually came to power in Moscow. This was despite Khrushchev's best attempts to forge closer and better relations between the two nations. Mao began to simply ignore the majority of Soviet advisors, eventually hitting on his own plan to allow China to take a great leap forward. Off of a cliff, as it turns out, as the program was a disaster, resulting in the deaths of millions. But it was emblematic of the rift that was forming in the socialist bloc. Fundamentally, Khrushchev and Mao harbored deep ideological differences over the legacy of Stalin. Khrushchev wished to de-Stalinize the Soviet government and system, moving away from cults of personality and Stalin's brutal, heavy industry-focused economic planning. Khrushchev wanted to improve citizens' access to consumer goods, the luxuries of modern life, and generally make people's lives better. He also took a much friendlier approach with the West, believing that rapprochement and peace could be achieved instead of the inevitable war anticipated by Stalin and Mao. Both of these policies damaged Mao's view of Khrushchev's credibility. Mao saw peaceful coexistence as eventually leading to the PRC's geopolitical isolation. He also saw a focus on consumer goods as a subtle return to capitalism. Furthermore, Mao modeled a lot of his applications of Marxism-Leninism, as well as his leadership style, on that of Stalin. Mao denounced Khrushchev as a revisionist and doubled down on Stalinism as the PRC's path forward. Their clashing views on peaceful coexistence came to a head when Chinese forces attacked the Matsu Islands in an attempt to establish Beijing's authority over the island of Taiwan. The attacks led to a geopolitical crisis, but crucially, Mao never informed Khrushchev of his plans. It nearly led to a catastrophic nuclear exchange between the PRC, the USSR, and the USA. Of course, the PRC didn't yet have its own atomic weapons, but would have been a definite target in the event that buckets of sunshine were exchanged. Khrushchev responded to Mao's unilateral decision-making by cutting off Mao's foreign aid, as well as plans underway to give China atomic weapons. Now, Mao also openly criticized the USSR and Yugoslavia for being insufficiently socialist. At the same time, the PRC built relations with a fellow Stalinist holdout, the Albanian leader Enver Hoxha. This prompted its own criticism from Khrushchev and resulted in a split between the USSR and Albania. This tension blew up at the 1960 International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties. Khrushchev criticized Orthodox Marxism and Leninism for being a wrong road to world socialism. At the same time, Mao called out Khrushchev's emphasis on consumer goods and material comfort, saying it would make the USSR ideologically soft. To which Khrushchev famously replied, "If we could promise the people nothing except revolution, they would scratch their heads and say, 'Isn't it better to have good goulash?'" This ideological battle led to devolving relations between the PRC and the USSR. Mao eventually cut off ties with the Soviets when they refused to go to war with the Americans during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mao stated that Khrushchev has moved from adventurism to capitulationism, apparently unconcerned with the possible apocalyptic effects of a nuclear exchange. The test ban treaties signed by the USSR and USA after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mao interpreted as the great powers trying to stymie China's ascendance to nuclear superpower. He saw Khrushchev as constantly failing to protect the communist world against capitalist incursion in the name of preventing Armageddon. In 1964, via an exchange of letters, Mao declared the USSR as having undergone a successful counter-revolution. Khrushchev, in Mao's mind, had re-established capitalism in the Soviet Union. In response, the Warsaw Pact nations broke off ties with the PRC. Even Khrushchev's successors remained at odds with Mao's view of Marxist theory and not worth re-establishing relations over. These differences might be the reason the Cold War played out as it did. While the West saw the communist world during this period as a homogeneous unit, acting in coordinated concert, in reality it was deeply fractured. Western decision-making was often based around the idea of a single ideological bloc. The decision-making processes made in the West that could seem in hindsight as heavy-handed overreactions may seem more understandable if we examine them from the perspective widely held at that time. As for those fractured communist nations, perhaps things would have been very different had they maintained a common front to counter the capitalists' economic advantage. Of course, that is speculation at the very best, pure guesswork at the worst, and not the business of this channel. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss out on our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and present a strong, unified front to the outside world so that nobody can see the backstabbing and other shithousery happening around the bell button. Press it. You know you want to. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at @thecoldwartv. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.